Greetings, and look, I'm very flattered that. Oh, I'm very flattered that anybody would turn up to hear. Now, Steve has accused me of being a philosopher, and I have to confess that I'm still in the course of my postgraduate study. I'm a research candidate, which means that I'm finishing my PhD, although I'm not sure whether I'm finishing it or it's finishing me, to be honest. Could be the latter, very much so. But look, I'm flattered and deeply honoured that you come along to hear me give a talk about the meaning of life, that you would come along to hear a 40-something divorcee who's being finished by a postgraduate degree do so. I promise that it's probably not going to be terribly long, on the basis that most of the depth is in a PowerPoint presentation. That's my roadmap and my guide, which is a reasonably dangerous way to go about things for different reasons. But essentially I'm approaching what I'm doing like very, very polished tutorial, many of which I've given, but with very, very broad material. Douglas Adams, one of my favourite science fiction authors, and I'm sure there are many other lovers of Douglas Adams here, wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And there's a statement in that book made by the very, very supercomputer Deep Thought in response to the question put to him about whether there is an answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything. And we'll just translate that as the meaning of life. That's the only bit we'll have a go at. And Deep Thought's response, or one of them, was yes, there is an answer. And I'd just like to share with you, in case you hadn't guessed, which I'm sure you have before we commence, that I have absolutely no idea what it is. I haven't got the first clue, but I've got a few different things that I would like to suggest that are worthwhile thinking about. And one of the main thrusts that I want to take is that the way that I want to approach things is to look at some more recent thought experimental ideas relating to ontology and subjectivist versus objectivist views of the world. That is the way that we look at the world and the way that we look at our lives and the way that we consider meaning, and just use that to get us stimulated in thinking about ideas that have been thrown up for a very, very long time. So the first thing to consider if you're a philosopher is, does this question matter, and do we care about it? And I think the answer to that's reasonably obvious. There are some people that still say, who cares? You can say who cares in a number of different ways. There's a philosophical movement called Quietism, which is not so much about who cares, but it's along the lines of, you're not really supposed to try and answer these things with any seriousness, and they're questions that are supposed to be left unanswered, and any effort to answer them or even discuss them is probably rather vacuous and pointless. And then there's a skeptical response which says, well, you can discuss it as much as you like, but you're not really going to produce anything that's fruitful, and you're not going to produce anything that's stimulating. And so on that basis, the best way to proceed is just be skeptical about the possibility of having any knowledge about the meaning of life at all. So those are some approaches that you can take. But of course, I'm interested also in the contrast between religious perspectives and what I like to call faithless perspectives about life and the meaning of life. And of course, we can list these. It's a very long list, really. But of course, the most key or central idea is that of divine revelation. This is the idea that life is underpinned or given and meaning along with it by some deity, God, or divine being. Okay, so there is a certain and sure meaning of some kind, and the person of faith or the religious person doesn't necessarily know exactly what that is, except to say that they defer to God. Right? So the content of the meaning, if you like, of life simply becomes God, the deity that they believe in, and is expressed through their faith in that deity. And there are lots of different ways that theologians and theists through history, and I'll focus mostly on theological philosophers, or theist philosophers like Descartes, and that's because I know more about theist philosophers than I know about theologians, and if I begin to try and debate on the basis of my knowledge of theologians, I'll do not so well. But there are lots of different views that have been put forward by theologians and by theist philosophers over a very long time, throughout history, throughout recorded history. And one of them is voluntarism, for example. This is the idea that there's a distinction between whether what happens in the universe and all the meaning that's given and the meaning of life is determined by God. It's just whatever he says it is, or whether he has, in fact, some kind of strictures or restrictions placed upon him by nature or parts of nature or by logic on some basis. But overall, I think that it would be agreed by most theologians that one thing that faith is supposed to give one, and of course, faith is supposed to incorporate, as I understand it, and I was a person of faith as an adult for some 14 or 15 years of my adult life. I did some theological training, although it was limited, and I know that although faith is supposed to incorporate an element of doubt, there certainly is also, historically speaking, a great deal of certainty that is sought for by faithless people and people of faith and religionists. And a good classic example of this again is Descartes. His entire pursuit of the idea of the cogito, was a familiar expression that many of us have heard that says, I think, therefore I am, emerged from his effort to find a concrete certainty in his existence. And the thing that he fixed upon was that he knew that he was thinking, and so that was definitely something real. And he rooted the important parts of his thinking and the origin of his thinking in God as a theist. There are of course a lot of other very famous arguments. There's the ontological argument that was originally put forward. Well, it wasn't really the most familiar one is Aquinas, although there are other scholars that have put forward ontological arguments for the existence of God. And of course, because God, or the divine being, or a divine being or deity, is the root of meaning for religious and faithless people. And of course, I understand that I'm focusing here on monotheistic faiths, but I've mentioned deism, and I understand that there's a very, very broad range of what can be regarded as religious devotion, and it can involve multiple deities and what have you. At this point, I'm just keeping the focus a little more simple, because otherwise the problem space is absolutely enormous, and the topic space also. The ontological argument, one version of it basically goes, there must be a perfect being of some kind that can possess perfect properties, okay? Because there have to be an entire range of possible properties that exist, and properties of knowing everything and understanding everything and being eternal must belong to some entity in the universe, and therefore basically God must exist. Alright, so that's a version of this argument and a component of it. And it's an early version of something that's more familiar now, which is the argument put forward by more contemporary analytic philosophers that conceivability entails possibility. But for Descartes and for other theologians and for many people of faith now, the idea is that what is entailed is actuality. If one believes it, and you don't have to conceive of the idea yourself, in fact it's usually not considered the right way to go about things, but if the idea is given to you and you believe in it, then actuality follows. Epistemic, if you like, certainty, or the certainty of the knowledge of knowing your God and knowing what is happening in the universe and having a meaning for your life on that basis is given. So here's a table that I put together, and this is one of these things that philosophers do that always seem like a good idea at the time. It's supposed to clarify things, and of course it's probably a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, but there's some tools for us to think about what's going on, because on the whole there's an enormous amount going on in considering the meaning of life. The first thing that we have to consider is that philosophers spend, and certainly analytic philosophers like myself, spend an enormous amount of time discussing what meaning actually is. So there's a question mark over what meaning is for a start. And then we spend an enormous amount of time also trying to determine what life is. And these are two questions, each of them, that could take an enormous amount of time to discuss, and I don't have that much time. So what I'm going to do is just identify a couple of different lines of division, or two lines of division, that tend to run through the entire discussion whenever philosophers and contemporary philosophers discuss the meaning of life. And also, it's good to know these things if one is speaking with a theologian or a person of faith, because you will have tools that they don't have if you are able to identify these differences, and you'll be able to debate them on the basis of using these definitions and the understanding of those tools. So philosophers look at ontology, that is what exists and how it exists, and things like meaning and also to some extent knowledge from an objective perspective, which is referred to as objectivism, and from a subjective perspective, which is referred to as subjectivism. And there's a third perspective that I'll introduce called perspectivism as well, which becomes important. But I only want to say a little bit about it because I don't want to overcomplicate matters. And then there are external attributions of what might give one meaning and what life is, and internal attributions. So, for example, and I won't go right through this whole table because I think hopefully that people get the general idea, but an external objective conception of life is going to be a naturalistic one, and it's going to involve a description of things that is what philosophers like to call mind and language independent. So it's got nothing to do with what anybody thinks, believes, knows, or think that they know. It simply is something that is the case regardless of what any human being or cognitive agent, that is thinking person or thinking being, or perceiving agent or perceiving being, has ever thought or thought that they knew or believed in or perceived. And then, of course, if we move to the internal, this is about what happens internally to the mind, however one thinks that exists and is realised for a human being. And it's about the individual person's experience of it. And it's objective because consciousness, for example, our phenomenological content, the way that we experience things happening within ourselves, our sense, if you like, of being awake, okay, it just happens to us. I mean, you can't sort of sit there and say, I'm going to stop being conscious now. Or sit there and say, I'm going to become more conscious. It tends to depend on what your body's doing, how tired you are, and if somebody knocks you unconscious, you're unconscious. If you're asleep, you have a level of consciousness. If you're awake, so it's a naturalistic way of looking at things. It's objective, but it has an internal effect. You see it from the inside, although it's something that we can't do anything about. And there are many things that go in this list here, but something that's objectively determined by evolution is our genetic makeup and all of the things that surround that, all of the things that are inherited by us, but they can also be, and they're internal to us, internal to our bodies, if you like, and our minds and so on. And again, as I said, there are philosophical viewpoints about the mind and how it exists. I happen to be a physicalist, so I think that the mind essentially reduces to a set of physical information processes in the brain, which is known as identity theory. But this is about objective things, objective meaning that exist within us. Then you've got the subjective view of things, and really to have a subjective view of the way that things exist in terms of anything to do with one's life or life on the whole, as external and subjective, you've got to be talking about what is called idealism. And this is the idea that someone like that was made famous, in fact, by the British empiricist Bishop Berkeley. And Berkeley's idea was that everything exists in the mind of God, or a God. So all of us and everything that we're sitting on and everything that we're sitting in, and the planet and everything it's all just an idea in the mind of God somehow. Everything is sustained by God's mind and is sustained as thoughts in God's mind. And of course, there's also the solipsistic view, which is the idea that one believes that there's no God involved, but for some reason, somehow, you are the only thing that is real and does exist in the universe, and everybody and everything else is somehow a figment of your imagination or thinking. So that's another subjectivist view of what's going on externally. And over here, of course, we've got the internal subjective view of what's happening here, which is that there's a way that it seems to be to have a conscious experience. And sometimes this is referred to in terms of qualia. So there's an enormous amount going on here, but it's these two distinctions that run right across the entire area of philosophy that deals with the meaning of life. And a lot of philosophers just leave it alone because it's regarded as something that is a little hard, but moreover, it's regarded as something that is perhaps a bit pompous to approach. But on the other hand, philosophers also acknowledge that it is in fact an incredibly interesting question, and people simply are interested in it, and philosophers can't not be interested in such questions. Okay, so there's these two sets of distinctions that I just wanted to bring to everybody's attention. So there's a philosopher of science by the name of Ronald Giel, and he introduces a way of looking at things called perspectivism. And the best way to describe this is the way that philosophers of science and philosophers and metaphysicians and some scientists discuss things like the realization of the perception of colour. So if you think about the colour red, there's the objectivist perspective that says the colour red exists and is real because there is a certain frequency that exists in the frequency spectrum, in the electromagnetic frequency spectrum, and that is what red is. Okay? Then there's a subjectivist view which says, no, that's not what red is. Red is what is processed in the brain after the distal information in the distal environment has been read by our senses, our eyes in this case, and red is something that we experience. It's a phenomenological content. It's a conscious content. It's something that goes on internally to us. Perspectivism, Gia's perspectivism, moves along the lines of, well, to some extent, his statement is that obviously it's got to do with both of those things, and we need to set the locus of how something is made real there on the basis of subjective elements and objective elements. So you've got these two lines of division that I mentioned initially. They're supposed to be helpful tools and hopefully haven't just been completely confusing. If they have, you can forget about them and we'll go on with some more simple elements. But this perspectivism is supposed to be the idea that, look, obviously, if you look at that table, some of these things seem to merge together. Okay. All right, so let's start with meaning. Philosophers spend endless hours of joyous, exalted disputation and argument on the topic of meaning. So meaning is construed so many different ways that it's not even possible, I think, to mention all of them in a 30 to 40 minute talk. But one very interesting, more contemporary way of looking at meaning was introduced by the naturalist and physicalist and atheist philosopher H.P. Grice. And he divided meaning into two broad categories. There's natural meaning, there's this idea of sort of a causally based meaning which is associated with indication that happens in our environment, which is exemplified in such states of affairs as smoke means fire. Right? That's the kind of meaning that he talks about in terms of the terms natural meaning. Spots caused by measles mean measles. Okay, so if you have the actual virus or any kind of virus which causes a certain kind of symptoms, and mumps, measles, whatever, if you've got a pathogen and it's causing a certain kind of symptoms, and there's nothing else in your body that's producing between which there's a causal pathway, in other words, there's nothing else in your body which is causing those apparent symptoms, that means that spots mean you have the pathogen. Okay, so that's natural meaning. And the thing about natural meaning is, it's difficult for it to be, in a sense, it's difficult for it to have what philosophers call a lethic value, for it to be true or false. Okay, it's not quite certain how it can be that smoke means fire can somehow be false, right? Or to see smoke and for that to objectively indicate that there's fire to be false. Whereas the other category of meaning given by Grice is non-natural meaning, and this is associated with mind and language dependent things. So if we go back here, so you'll remember in the list here we had naturalistic things and objective things are mind and language independent. They've got nothing to do with what anybody thinks or anybody's brain or anybody's mind or cognition. And so non-natural meaning does have to do with those things. It's over in this category over here on the right-hand side. And it's also to do with, obviously, language. So propositional things. And this means sentences, descriptions, anything with statements in it, including logical statements, that have a lethic value, that is, they can be true or false. So this is just to introduce the idea that if we're going to talk about the meaning of life, and we're going to be a little bit analytic about it, and we're going to have philosophical content, hopefully without overdoing it too much, then we're going to see very quickly that, of course, as we all suspect, that it's an enormous question. Okay? And life is even more difficult and has an even more fractured and chaotic history in terms of the conception of what life is and what it means. Again, there's an objectivist view which talks about life in biological terms and in terms of evolutionary history, etc. This is obviously external and objectivist, but at the same time there's the overlap here, the perspectivism, the perspectival overlap, which of course indicates that although our brain, for example, seems to be very much part of us and part of our life, it exists objectively. The existence of my brain or Nick's brain or anybody else's brain in the room has got to do with what nature did, and maybe the content, the informational content, might have to do with what we've learned from other people, but the brain itself has, evolved over the course of time to be a truth-tracking organ, and which is part of a truth-tracking organism, which enables that organism to survive better and it's an objective thing. Okay, so that's external objective conception, the naturalistic idea of what life is. And then, of course, there's life as what we experience. There's our subjective, narratological, if you like, experience of life, our internal experience of life. Life as we live it, our phenomenal consciousness, our phenomenal experiences. When I say the word phenomenal, I mean what's going on in terms of your experience inside your head based on what is happening, as connected with what's happening in the world around you. And there's the perspectival element one more time. Okay, so getting now to nitty-gritty a little bit more on things that are a bit familiar. So I apologise for that those upfront technicalities. There'll be a few more, but they'll be a bit more interesting, I feel, and a bit more challenging. So when we think perspectively, we try and take into account the ontic, the external, what's going on in the universe, and also our experience of it and what we feel and what's happening within ourselves. And I remind you, the reason why I'm going down this road a little bit is that one of the things that's important to us is to think about how atheists and non-theists and people who are not religionists can approach the meaning of life and different angles that we can come at it, and different bases upon which we can discuss it and think about it at a fairly low and technical level, but also in a very real way as connected with our experience. So this is an extract, a lizard photo from one of my favourite movies, which is Time Bandits, which is a handmade film. It's a Terry Gilliam film. And this character's name is Og, and they're wandering through the desert, and they're having a pretty hard time. There's plenty of the things that we all experience in life, lots of suffering, lots of hardship, lots of pain, lots of bickering, and lots of nasty stuff going on. And they run into an invisible kind of force field or glass wall. One of the characters says, "What's that?" And Og says, "I don't know, but it hurts." Okay, so there are all sorts of things going on here. Of course, you can pick any example out of any movie anywhere, and you can use it to, to riff these cues and these ideas. But they've got an objective situation happening that's not within their control, and that's arguable, the degree to which it's within their control and how they end up there, and what that had to do with their behaviour and their actions is debatable, and is a huge debate amongst philosophers. We debate determinism and quasi-determinism and compatibilism, which means, so determinism is the idea that everything that happens to you has just been determined by, so if you have a full physical description of the universe, the state of the universe at a given point in time, then you will be able to, if you were the perfect computer, or you had a perfect computer, or you were, to use a metaphor, some kind of God that could figure out what was going to happen on the basis of all the vectors of all the particles and all the states and processes in the universe. Determinism says if you knew the full description of what's happening in the entire universe now, you would know exactly what's going to happen in 30 seconds' time, arguably exactly what's going to happen further down the track. There are plenty of arguments associated with this that try to undermine it. One example is emergence. I won't try and go into that now because it just makes things too complicated. Other examples are related to what we call nonlinear dynamics and complex systems, and I won't try and go into those either. It's getting too technical. So getting back to this again, determinism is the idea that everything's determined. So, you've got characters here who are suffering. They're in an environment that doesn't seem to be fully determined by them, and each of their lives has a sort of a form of a story. They fit into a story on the whole. And you can see here that there are lots of themes that are familiar from religious texts and religious way and faithist way of approaching life. Certainly narrative's very big and very important to religious folk. Okay? There's a grand story, a grand narrative into which one's life fits to give one's life meaning, and one's life itself has a little narrative component that contributes to that overall grand narrative. So one has one's own narrative, and as we'll see in the later slides, philosophers like Daniel Dennett, a philosopher very dear to everybody's heart here, or atheist's heart here, I'm sure, a narrative theory of the self is very important to somebody like Dennett. Okay? So we're investigating here and we're exploring ways in which there are some similarities between the way that atheists, or the way that atheists can look at the world, or at least there are some things that are familiar to and from religious approaches to doing things, but of course there are some big differences and some big distinctions too, which we'll get to. Subjective experience is happening, there's an objective setting, and there's what we call limited epistemic access. You can know a certain amount about what's going on, and I don't think any atheist worth their salt, including the Lawrence Krauses and the Richard Dawkins of the world. In fact, of course we know that Professor Dawkins has put forward statistical approach to these things, whereby there's no really serious certainty to be had along the lines that Descartes was interested in. Descartes was interested in dead certainty, absolutely no doubt certainty, even though he was a person of faith. And the contrast with the scientistic, and I know that the word scientistic is used in a derogatory fashion, but we'll get to that later in the talk also. Of course, the statistical approach of Professor Dawkins is not an approach that's rooted in certainty in that way. So just to give a little bit of history, a little bit of background, it's probably a good idea. We certainly can't go through everything because it's enormous. What is life? This is the last slide that I'll really spend on this, except to touch on ontological issues. And ontology, as I said to you before, is a metaphysical, is a sub-discipline in metaphysics, and ontology just means, well, what exists and how. Okay, so what is part of the furniture of the universe? What's the real stuff, and what's figments of somebody's imagination? Okay. So the vitalists were interested in this idea that life, externally and objectively, so we're talking more about a naturalistic viewpoint, came from like a life force or vital essence. And the idea that everything rolled along on the basis of this life force or vital essence. Things have survival instincts because of the vital essence. Things have life itself, all natural things, plants, animals, and human beings, because there's this part of the furniture of the universe, there's this thing in the ontology that does exist called the vital essence, and it has some sort of special property that makes everything have life. Okay. Now, of course, this is eliminated later with reductionist science. Through the course of the scientific revolution, everybody stops talking about such things as life forces and vital essences and starts thinking in reductionist terms, meaning breaking living systems and organisms and so on down to their finite structure or their smaller structures, and explaining things on that basis. Then, of course, we've got from the continental school of philosophy, much more from the continental school of philosophy, the idea of existentialism. Now, the origins of existentialism, I apologise, I'm getting tired, can be traced to the disturbing Dane. Does anybody know who the disturbing Dane was? Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard was the disturbing Dane because he disturbed all the theologians because he said disturbing, upsetting things about God, like why does God give me a hard time and I don't like it, and that kind of stuff. But the point to Kierkegaard's view as an existentialist view was that he focused on the being, on the person and their experience of life, and was trying to figure out in the framework of his Protestant theology, why do I feel like this and why does it happen to me? And of course, there was no answer available to him, so he just sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, it's existentialism, I am what I am, and that's how I go about things. And of course, there's a pathway through Martin Heidegger, whose history and background is spotted at best. I won't go into that, but he started to really dwell on this idea, along with some other German existentialists and some other continental philosophers, and consider the idea of what it was to be in different ways. And the way he considered being was quite complex, and the German existentialists especially, like Kant, rather like Kant to some extent, Kant's not nearly as bad, but are famous for being willfully abstruse, shall we say. In fact, Heidegger was the philosopher that said that as soon as philosophy makes itself understandable, it commits suicide. So if you want to start philosophy anywhere, don't start with Heidegger. And he was somewhat of a Nazi aside from that anyway, and that's not being flippant, he really was. So Jean-Paul Sartre is usually a bit more respectable, somewhat a Marxist character. Being in Nothingness, very interesting read. Really interesting read because he embraces determinism. He sort of shrugs his shoulders and says, well, I think determinism is probably just the case. But he also thinks somehow that if you delete, and I won't go into this either because it's quite sort of terminologically heavy, even more than I've already exposed you to. He wants to delete the part of our psychology that allows you to worry about determinism, as it were, and just focus on the fact that he's there. So an illustration that I really like to use for existentialism is again from our good friend Douglas Adams. And if anybody's, hopefully, raise your hand if you've seen at least one of the Douglas Adams films. Good-o, so I'm not talking to the wall, that's a good thing. So, who likes the scene with the missiles and the flower pot and the whale, right? They're in the heart of gold and they're fleeing from the Vogons at whatever, really fast speed the impossibility drive gives them, and that's science fiction, by the way. We know of, there's nothing real in that particular set of ideas. But they're fleeing from the Vogons, and sorry, they're not fleeing from the Vogons. They're approaching Magrathea. I apologise, I'm getting the science fiction wrong now because I'm tired. But 2 missiles are fired at them by the denizens of Magrathea, and the starship Heart of Gold turns one of the missiles into a whale that starts to descend towards the surface of the planet, and the other into a flower pot. Now, the flower pot, quite famously in literary circles, thinks to itself, "Oh no, not again." The whale is the one well, the flower pot's fairly interesting, but the flower pot is a reference to something that Nietzsche said, which is referred to as the eternal return, which we'll just leave right out because it's quite balmy. But the whale is existentialist. The whale comes into being, he's thrown into being, bang, suddenly he's just there. And it's quite a comic treatment, of course, in the film. He starts swishing his tail about, says, "Oh, what's that rushing sound, you know? Well, what's this big round thing coming towards me? I think I'll call it the ground," and then splat, that's it, he's finished. So, you know, that's a nice illustration of the way that existentialist thought is supposed to be approached. And I quite like different bits of existentialism. So, you know, if you're feeling a bit empty and a bit vacant and a bit vague, maybe there's a place you could look, you know. Existentialist writing is fairly terse sometimes, but that basic illustration is pretty good. And this idea of being thrown into life and having no choice about it seems to have, you know, a somewhat nice subjective and perspectivist content to it. And then, of course, we've got nihilism. Now, nihilism is a terribly abused term, and mostly, I must say, by religionists, by Atheists. If you don't believe in God, you're automatically a nihilist, and you don't believe anything at all, including especially anything good, and there's nothing good about you, and they might as well throw you in the fire right now. That's not the kind of nihilism that philosophers usually talk about. So, I mentioned Nietzsche, and he's often accused of being a nihilist, and this is rubbish, because Nietzsche was obviously not a nihilist about truth, otherwise he wouldn't have stood up for years and years and years and barked at the church saying, "You've got it all wrong, fools." I'm sorry, he did say that, you know, paraphrase, but essentially he was very hard on them, okay? He challenged them in what would have been considered, and was considered, the most rude fashion at the time that he could possibly come up with and get away with it, and probably overdid it. But he was not a nihilist about truth, and he was arguably not necessarily... Now, he did make statements that you couldn't know anything, so there's a strong argument that he might be a nihilist about knowledge, but I'm not even convinced about that. I'm not a great Nietzsche scholar, but I do like Nietzsche, and, you know, anyway, that's to point out that nihilism is not necessarily about what our faithist and religionist friends tell us that it is. Where am I going here? So going back further in history, you had the Greek Academy. And when I say the fate of Socrates here, sorry, that's misleading. I'm not actually talking about fate, although it's interesting in the context accidentally. I'm talking about what happened to him for being impious. But the interesting thing about Socrates is, although he was persecuted and essentially assassinated indirectly for impiety, which was really thumbing his nose at the established order, including religious frameworks at the time, he nevertheless had something of a pious viewpoint himself, if you look at the way that he regarded things. But of course, we don't have very much history about how he went about things. Plato was interested in viva activa and... hang on, what have I done here? Let's just go to justice and virtue. The viva activa and the viva contemplativa came up as part of the banter between Plato and Aristotle. But the idea is that it's what you do in life and your actions that count. And the reason it became confusing was because the viva activa was supposed to be getting out there and being active and doing things actively in the community and participating, you know, and engaging participation in a major way. And the viva contemplativa was supposed to be basically navel-gazing in a really intelligent and self-fulfilling way. And there's a clash between the two things that don't end up going together very well. And especially because Plato thought that the idea of philosopher kings was fantastic. You shouldn't have any kind of democracy or senate or anything like that. You just find the smartest guy in the room and get him to tell everybody what's what. Then the viva activa and the viva contemplativa and the clash between them became a real problem. He was very interested in justice. So a lot of religious thought has similar themes to this. Meaning is about how you do things and what you do. We're starting to touch on moral content. We're starting to touch on the way that we perform things in life, what we do in life, and so on. But Aristotle was interesting because he thought that virtue attained through happiness. and happiness attained the right way was the right way to establish one's meaning, or to fulfill the meaning of one's life. And they didn't try to penetrate any deeper than that. I've mentioned some of these things already, so I'll skip through them. Thomas Hobbes, very famous, just after wrote the Leviathan, not long after the English Civil War. The English Civil War, of course, was nasty and brutish, although not so short. It was a very internecine and horrible exchange, and this led Thomas Hobbes to be very pessimistic about human beings' ability to treat each other well if they weren't ruled over by an iron fist of enforcement and so on. So that's Thomas Hobbes for you. I won't go any further into that because most people are a little familiar with the idea of life being nasty, brutish and short, and the idea of the Leviathan as the iron-fisted imperial monarch that told everybody what to do and couldn't do any wrong themselves. This was in reasonably sharp contrast to Rousseau, who thought that civilization, the kind of civilization especially that Hobbes suggested, and Hobbes didn't even like the Aristotelian scholars, but Rousseau didn't like Hobbes' sort of ideas one little bit, and there's an anachronism here in terms of chronology, but the themes are correct. Civilization was the problem for Rousseau because it took away our natural human empathy. Competition, striving and competing with each other on the basis of trying to achieve better than your neighbour, going for all the beautiful things and the beautiful people, and so on, created tension and enmity, etc. And building up resources in agriculture and industry led to the breakdown of the idea of human beings treating each other in an empathetic manner. Okay, and of course, there's very religious commonalities here, but they're established on a different basis. And the interesting thing about Rousseau is he put forward in one of the writing that is most relevant to this, he put forward a quasi-anthropological piece of writing describing how this might have rolled out in human history. And although it's not very scientific, it's actually very, very clever. Okay, so moving on a little bit more through history, you've got the empiricist theists, Berkeley and Locke. So the empiricists were the philosophers and natural theologians and natural philosophers of their day that, in the 1600s thereabout and afterwards, that the idea for them was that truth was associated with what you experienced, and of course if you're a theist and a theistic thinker and a religious person, and especially if you believe in divine inspiration, etc., you can experience divinely inspired things. It's a bit of a problem proving it to anybody else, but you can claim that anyway, and prospectively, arguably it might be very difficult to prove that it's not the case. Berkeley was the character that came up with the idea of idealism that we've already covered, which is that meaning and life and everything exists in God's mind. Okay? Locke had a bit of a different take on things to Hobbes, but he was also a theist, and he didn't think that life was nasty, brutish and short. It wasn't allowed to be because God's supposed to be taking care of meaning in life and saving people, so it can't be too foul down here. That's all for hell. Okay. Hume is one of my favourites. This is the man who prompted the very interesting, and a lot of people don't realise this about Hume, but Kant owes his existence as a philosopher to Hume, not only because he references Hume, but if you contemporary philosophers and scholars are looking at Hume's work now and realising and have realised for some time, at Kant's work now and have realised for some time that Kant was basically his patrons employed him to take Hume apart. Okay. But Hume was the original skeptic. He wasn't what we call a Purist skeptic. He didn't believe you couldn't have any knowledge at all, and it couldn't have been that kind of skepticism because he believed in science and scientific investigation. So the thing I like about Hume is when it really comes down to the question of what does everything mean and why am I a philosopher and what am I thinking about, the direction he goes in is basically backgammon. He says the conclusion of this book, this is the end of what they call the inquiry, which is his first technical masterpiece. Before I launch into one of those immense depths of philosophy which lie before it, and then there's a break during which he discusses alienation and doubts about being able to know anything and what he perceives, and skepticism about knowledge to some extent. And then he says, most fortunately it happens that since reason is incapable of, is incapable, of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose, and cures me of this philosophical melancholy, it's supposed to say, sorry, I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse and am merry with my friends. In other words, I stop caring about it very much. It's all too hard. Okay, so that's actually Hume, which is interesting. So, just in contrast to that, we've got meaning from a religious perspective. As I've said already, it's God. There are a few different bits of content here that matter to religious people and faithists, especially monotheists. There's predestination. The idea that God, the idea that God has already determined everything that's going to happen to you, and this is not agreed upon by theologians at all, as I understand it. And there are themes of self-sacrifice, laying down your own life to serve God and serve other people, evangelization, and different others of amen. But of interest, of course, to atheists and the way that we approach the world is that you're not supposed to trust in your own intellect, you're not supposed to trust in your own understanding, you're not supposed to trust in any of the faculties that have been given to you in our understanding by nature. You're simply supposed to believe in the doctrinal ethics and go with those. So that's again where meaning comes from. This is some more descriptions of meaning. I'll just defer back to the slide about Grice, H.P. Grice, and natural and non-natural meaning. Most of these things fit into that, but there's a lot in it. The only thing I'll mention out of this set is information, because I'm going to hit upon that a little bit at the end of the slides, because I take on the challenge as a philosopher. As not a quietist philosopher, I try and take on the challenge of what the meaning of life is, just a tiny little bit. And I'll have to ask him in advance to forgive me for that, because it'll probably be terrible. But non-linguistic meaning, so there's a whole list of different things. I've already discussed determinism. Fate is not the same thing as determinism, but I won't go into that right now. Or maybe I'll go into it a little bit. Fate is the idea that, so determinism is the idea if you've got a full physical description of the entire universe, you'll know what happens in the future. Fate says it doesn't matter what you know, even if you've got a full physical description of the universe, something's going to happen in the future, but that still doesn't tell you anything about it. But there's something still fated, usually by an external force or idea, like God or a deity or something. And of course, we've referred to naturalistic and causal meaning under the heading of Grice as two different conceptions of meaning. I'm not even going to try and touch the range of different deistic views about meaning and life, because they're just so prolific. But there certainly are plenty of answers available to the atheist and the naturalistic atheist to respond to these things. So just picking on one of these, the anthropic cosmological principle is the idea that the universe somehow comes to know itself. Well, I mean, the philosopher and the scientist can immediately start asking what defines the universe and what goes in and what goes out and what's part of the set of things that matter, and it just gets quite so. Here's the more juicy and interesting part of the evening, and I'll race through this because I think everybody's getting tired and I'm taking longer than I thought I would. So thought experiments are a way that philosophers think about things by holding different variables and ideas constant and moving forward. So these are things to challenge on an ontological basis and epistemological basis. That's the idea of how we know things. What might really be going on in the universe? And so again, we're going back here to the theme of certainty and statistical uncertainty and so on. So if you've seen The Matrix, there's the character in The Matrix whose name I've forgotten that decides he wants to take the pill that sends you back into the Matrix because he likes eating steak and fast food and all that kind of thing, and he thinks, I don't care whether I know what's going on or not. And this goes back to a thought experiment offered by Robert Nozick. It's called the experience machine. The idea is exactly that. You're putting a machine, you're in a bath, you're hooked up to a bunch of wires. It's not the brain in a vat, it's very similar. And you program into it to give you all your heart's desires. The life that you always wanted, that's what you get when you're in the machine. And then the big question is that a real life, and does it have real meaning? Okay. The idea of possible worlds is another complication, so here's another direction that one can go. And the reason possible worlds are really interesting, now this is a logical way of approaching things, not so much a scientific way or a scientific way of approaching things. The idea of possible worlds arises out of the study of modal logics, of subjunctive modal terms, which are things like maybe and if it were the case, not if it were the case, maybe, maybes and whens and so on. the thing about this is, if you've got a whole set of possible worlds that are different from each other, and Lewis was interesting because he believed in a thing called modal realism. And modal realism, the idea is that the world where we're all wearing no clothes or pink bows in our hair, or there are floating kangaroos stuck to the ceiling, all of those worlds are actually physically real somewhere, somehow. And I find this completely balmy, but a lot of people, including several philosophers, take it reasonably seriously. So, and if the property in a distant enough possible world can change, and there's this idea of the accessibility operator, which I won't go into, but essentially you can get possible worlds which are very bizarre and they're quite real. And the thing is that if David Lewis is somehow right, and he's got an extraordinary logical argument that's very hard to argue against to demonstrate that he might be right. I don't think he is, but he's got a very interesting argument to demonstrate that he might be right. Then if we figure out what meaning in life is in this world and what the meaning of life is in this world, it won't matter a hoot to the next world because it could be completely different there and based on different properties. So there's an interesting way to approach things. This is Saul Kripke, the inventor of modal logic, essentially, and he thinks also that this view is not really coherent. Interestingly enough, he is a very devout Jewish person. Okay, here's another challenge for us. If we're thinking about the meaning of life, and we want to connect that up with the idea of ontology and what exists, why, and how. And this is a picture of deep thought, by the way, from the BBC television series that was based on Douglas Adams' book in the late 1980s, I believe. This depiction of deep thought is my favourite, this ominous, great, glowing thing in the dark that tells everybody it doesn't know, have a clue what's going on, but it will build another deep thought for them to figure it out, including the planet Earth. I want to use this to introduce the simulation argument of Nick Bostrom, with which I'll more or less finish. The simulation hypothesis says that, and this is a lot here, but you can go through it quite quickly and it's understandable. It says the universe is probably infinite in terms of time and space. You don't know it for sure, but a statistical likelihood it might be. If that's true, then there are a vanishingly small likelihood that no other advanced civilizations have evolved, right? In other words, there are probably other alien civilizations out there. If they have, then there is a non-zero and in fact quite high probability that at least one of these civilizations has developed way beyond the current intellectual and material capabilities and technological capabilities of humankind. You've heard these things before in science fiction all the time. And moreover, may have better cognitive faculties and other faculties that we do, meaning that the likelihood that the civilizations have not developed some kind of extremely advanced and powerful computer is extremely low, right? So the likelihood is that there are lots of big, powerful computers in the universe running lots of big, powerful simulations on this argument. And this is a physicist that posed this argument, not a philosopher. So the likelihood that they haven't done so is arguably vanishingly small, and by these arguments, we are in fact likely to be in one of those simulations, right? So the statistical likelihood on the basis of this very coherent argument by these physicists is you're actually in a simulation, right? So that's a game changer, okay? And the funny thing about this, I had a discussion with two, a very stimulating discussion and challenging discussion with two of our members here last time I was here. And I had to think about it deeply later, but the funny thing about this is that it doesn't mean that everything is kind of vapor or ethereal, because computers that we know and use are all physical, and all the energy and information processing in them is physical, and everything that happens in them is physical, although there are sort of relational and mathematical processes and machinations that go on. But you can still be a physicalist and certainly be an atheist and think that this could possibly be true. It could be huge simulations all the way down for who knows how long, bottoming out in we don't know what, but there doesn't have to be a God anyway. So I want to bounce off that one. That's a potential game changer for the meaning of life, but it's also potentially maybe not such a game changer. And this particular character here, Australian philosopher by the name of David Chalmers, says, lots of people that don't like David Chalmers. David Chalmers is a dualist about mind for a start on the basis of what is called what he calls supervenience dualism. I might get a chance to say something about that in a minute, and I disagree wholeheartedly with that. I think it's just, I know other philosophers, I should say it this way, I know very much better, much stronger academics at the university that I've been trained at that just don't agree with this at all. But he's one person that says if the Bostrom experiment is true, then there's nothing you can do about it, and who cares? It just doesn't matter. It makes no difference to whatever the meaning of your life is, it makes no difference. I think objectively, arguably, that's probably not the case. But it's something to think about, and it's something that religionists are not going to want anybody to think about, and they certainly don't want to think about themselves, I'm afraid, sorry, in most cases, as I've found it, although there are exceptions. David Chandler is also interesting because he's interested in the idea of qualia, that's phenomenal experience. And qualia are very important not only to our experience of being a person and living our lives, arguably, but the interesting thing about them is they're supposed to be an out from physicalistic determinism of the kind that I mentioned before, where you've got a full physical description of the universe and you can tell everything that goes on. Associated with this is the idea of the explanatory gap. We're moving into the territory of the philosophy of mind heavily now, and 5 minutes, cognitive science. And so the qualia are supposed to be qualities, the way we, apologies, I'll start that again. When you're experiencing something, then the quality, the way that it is to have that experience subjectively for you, the property of that, that's the qualia. And the idea is you're not supposed to be able to reduce that in any sense on a scientific basis to chemical processes or information processing or anything like that. Okay. And I won't mention dualism and I won't mention Quine, that will just complicate things too much, but Quine is one of the leading physicalist materialist philosophers of the Netherlands. Here's our hero Daniel Dennett, one of our heroes. I said that narrative perspectives and little narratives fitting into big narratives are important. One very important thing that Dennett says, which currently is being argued with by, somebody help me. Somebody's arguing with Dennett. One of
Harris.
Thank you very much, Sam Harris. I'm really getting tired. Sam Harris is currently having a pitch battle with Dennett about, and a friendly pitch battle, but nevertheless a very enlightening one, about free will and what we call compatibilism. And the idea is, so compatibilism is the idea is that even if determinism is true somehow, the deterministic physicalistic thing, then you can still have free will. Harris thinks this has probably got to be wrong. Dennett thinks the reason he thinks this has got to be wrong, and I won't go into it. However, I'll say this. It's arguable that the reason that Dennett thinks compatibilism, that is the idea you can have free will, subjective free will, even if determinism is true, he thinks that's the case, but he thinks so on a pragmatic basis, and I believe he puts the cart before the horse. He says we've got to be able to do that, otherwise there's no law and there's no justice and so on, but philosophers are not supposed to think like that. Now, Dennett's a much bigger gun than I am, so I'm hesitant to challenge him on that basis. But you're not supposed to go that way around. You're supposed to say, well, what actually does exist and what is the case, and then what happens after that. Not what would we really like in our fluffy hearts to happen, because if it doesn't happen that way, it's a really miserable world to live in. You know, maybe one of David Lewis's real possible worlds. Don't know. Anyway, so I promised that I'd cut to the end, and I will. Andy Clark's got a theory called ecological controls, but I won't get into that. But that's about the self too, the idea of how the self exists. Narrative views I've already mentioned, Dennett I've already mentioned. Diachronicity and episodic narrative styles are important. The idea is that some of us feel that our lives are a grand narrative, mostly religious people fit into that schema. Other persons, sometimes from Eastern cultures and Eastern religions, don't feel that. They feel their life is just a set of narratives that are disconnected in significant ways. There's not really much to say here. I could have said more, but I didn't really want to make it a pillar of sort of an enterprise. But the project of creation is evidently a neo-Aquinian in a way approach to re-establishing God as a locus of meaning in the face of scientism and science and naturalistic thinking. So here we go, we're at the end now. What did I do? The answer, 42, okay, Douglas Adams' answer. This is an expression of absurdism, which I didn't really cover, but it's a form of existentialism. So it says, look, life is absurd. There's no meaning. It's just, what? You know, why are we here? Who knows? It's just crazy, okay? One thing leads to the next. It's all a big accident. There's no point trying to work it out. You can't do anything about it anyway. Camus is actually a lovely philosopher to read. He's a great philosopher to read. I like Camus. And this is his viewpoint. You know, life is just absurd. The universe is absurd. There's no point trying to make sense of it. Even if there is any kind of sense to be made of it in some sort of objective, naturalistic sense, in terms of tracing things back to their cause and their cause and their cause, then it's still absurd from a human perspective. It doesn't make any sense. So here's what I think. So there's a quietism, which we've already discovered. There's a perspectivism. Here's a naturalistic way of going about things that takes into account some of the challenges that I've already put forward in terms of Nozik's machine and the simulations of computers all the way down, sort of ontology. And what I think is that we can think about not only evolutionary processes, and of course religionists are interested in this too, and this is a sticking point for creationists, and a whole intelligent design debate is about this kind of thing. But let's just take the brain, for example. Do I want to say, like somebody like Carl Sagan, that I'm just stardust, and I come from the stars and I'm going back in this kind of big Epicurean fashion, and it doesn't really matter, I'm not that important? Well, maybe in the grand scheme of things I'm not that important, but there's a funny thing to be said here. The brain is absolutely the most complex and bizarre information processor and structural entity that we know. Okay, and we've all got one between our ears. We've got a couple of surgeons and medicos in the room, so I'm not going to try and teach you into neuroscience because it would be embarrassing. But I do know a lot about, having a background in computer science and doing a PhD in information theory and philosophy of information, is that complexity is one measure of information. It's a measure of information introduced in one form by the Russian statistician and mathematician Andrei Kolmogorov. And I won't go into it in depth, but for Kolmogorov, the complexity of an object, and an object in his case was a string of letters or numbers or what have you, had to do with how long the program is that you need to run to produce, there's a bit of Turing in there as well, but to produce the object, if you like. Okay, that's complexity. The thing about this measure of complexity is that recently molecular bioscientists have applied it to things like protein synthesis and molecules, etc. And protein synthesis and things like our brains demonstrate that each one of us walking around does have an unbelievably and uniquely, in terms of our scientific understanding of a very, very scientific understanding of what is going on in the universe, the thing between your ears is spectacularly special and unique on a naturalistic basis, I think. So you've got a subjective perspective there in a way, but you've got a very naturalistic way of looking at things too. So that means that, one way to go is to think about the simulations and so on, but the other way to go is, well, look, science really is arguably a terribly fulfilling way of figuring out what we mean and why we're here, not just on an objective kind of external basis, but because we all have a brain, and arguably our minds all reduced to physical information processing. We can find out as much as possible about what's going on there right down to the quantum level. Then I don't think that that's a sterile way to look at the meaning of life at all, if we can manage to connect that with the best science to what's happening at other levels of our experience. And there are lots of things being done in that direction. That's the question of the talk. I'm sorry if it was a little long, but longer than I promised, but it's been lovely to talk to you all, and thank you for hearing me.
Any questions? John?
I'm disappointed that you seem to have deliberately avoided the major French postmodernists.
Okay, Deleuze and...
who I think collectively would argue that life does not have meaning. And yes, getting back to Deleuze, Deleuze argues that we live in not a disciplined society, but a controlled society. And the major instrument of social control is marketing. Can you comment on that?
I don't know as much about Deleuze now, or at least what I knew well, I've forgotten somewhat. And I understand your conviction, and I promise that it wasn't purposeful, except to the extent that I'm largely an analytic philosopher, so I'm less expert in those areas. But one philosopher, continental philosopher, that goes very much in that direction is Baudrillard. And he introduces the idea of the hyperreal, which is fairly familiar territory in regards to Deleuze and Lyotard and these other French continental philosophers that you're referring to. And of course, this is also exemplified in the movie The Matrix. The idea of the hyperreal goes back to the idea of the desert of the real. And if you remember, Morpheus in the movie The Matrix refers to, he says, "Welcome to the desert of the real," when he introduces Neo to this kind of idea that they're all living in this massive simulation. Okay, it's just a simulation. Now, this is a metaphor for Baudrillard. It comes from Baudrillard's metaphor of the desert and the real, and it comes from an adaptation of a poem by Borges, I think it was, or I can't remember right now, sorry, it's just the name's going out of my head because I'm tired. But the idea is that the denizens of a city make a map of the territory, and the map is a constructed artifact, and it covers the, it's an imaginary thing obviously, but it's making a point, it's a metaphor. It covers the territory to the extent that it becomes annoying and painful, and the desert of the real occurs when the map becomes more real than the territory, and everybody reads the map and then forgets what really is going on. And marketing and science and all of those things are included at different levels for Baudrillard in that. And I think Deleuze has some crossover with Deleuze's criticism there too. So, in that sense, again, the problem with continental and postmodernist philosophers is, as you say, there's a nihilism about meaning, if you will, but there seems to be arguably some limit to that too, and I would want to dispute you about it because there are nuances which I'm not as expert at with regard to it. But remember that I mentioned that Nietzsche, who is the father of a lot of continental philosophy and whom Deleuze and a lot of these French continental philosophers do refer to, is not really a nihilist about things that some people accuse him of being a nihilist about. And so the question we have to ask ourselves prospectively, and I know this is possibly can be regarded as mean-hearted, is, well, why are the postmodernists saying that in the first place? Okay? And there seems to be some kind of meaning in their statement. Now, there's a circularity in there which I can be accused of sort of cheating for, but I take onto account of it. So one of the erstwhile academics at the University of Sydney, Adrian Heathcote, who's a devout materialist and atheist, just never took seriously the postmodernist idea that there's no truth, or sorry, there's no meaning on that basis, because for him meaning supervenes on truth. But of course, Deleuze raises a question over whether that's true as well, as I understand it, whether that's the case. So they're very, very different ways of approaching things. So that's getting technical again. So I apologise, I didn't mean necessarily to omit it, it's just that I had to go with my strengths, and that's not necessarily okay. But thank you, John. Yeah, that's a very sound point. Yes?
You were talking about this theory that all our world is a big simulation. Well, I couldn't help but noticing that argument was based on an analysis of the universe and the number of highly advanced civilizations, etc., etc. If it is a simulation, then the entire universe is a simulation. So the argument for it being a simulation is based on an analysis of the simulated universe. Seems to be a
circularity there, ontologically speaking, yeah. Well, I'm not sure that it necessarily follows that the simulation has to be of the entire universe. The simulation could sit within the universe, and if they're clever enough aliens, we could have visibility of bits of the universe but still be in a simulation. Okay, so think of a computer simulation like a big fancy computer game that takes inputs and stimuli from users, etc. So it's hooked up to the external world in different ways. If you can make that sophisticated enough, the damn thing might not know that it's partly simulation. Again, mean. Sorry.
There's one piece.
That's a very good point. The circularity is a very good thing to spot. Yes.
There's actually one piece of evidence for the holographic universe.
The holographic universe. Fantastic.
The Planck scale is slightly off what we expected it to be.
Yeah, interesting.
Which implies resolution, basically. The Planck scale is the smallest.
Does anyone know the number? Do we have a physicist in the room? It's a number. It's
I think it is actually. I think it was 10 to the minus 42.
We'll go with that. The Planck scale is, so Planck length is, Max Planck, the physicist, Planck length is the length of time and space-time. That's not really, so the metrics are all different, but the way of measuring them.
Yeah.
This is what Einstein began to strongly suspect. Einstein actually began to strongly suspect that the universe was discretized and digital and wasn't a continuous flow, a sort of seamless continuous flow, but it was more like a CD, and the digits are at the Planck length.
Yeah, so there's some evidence that resolution. Resolution.
That's right, and that's pretty damn scary because that's the way simulations are based, right? So if you put that together with possible worlds, then sometimes I just want to be the guy that goes back into the Matrix and takes whichever pill it is.
The blue one.
The blue one. Take the blue pill. It's too scary. Yeah, sorry.
Before humans developed consciousness, they probably never thought about the meaning of life. and say that all these questions have all sort of evolved since man acquired consciousness. So philosophers still haven't come out with an answer. So what is the role of a philosopher nowadays?
Well, with respect to that particular thing, that's a very good question, thank you. So, philosophers are very interested, especially philosophers of mind like Chalmers, etc., although I think he makes a meal of it. I've got others that agree with you. Yeah, yes. But philosophers, and this includes Pinker and linguists and Chomsky and folk like that, who are scientific philosophers of different sorts. But mentalese is this. Mentalese is supposed to be some kind of language that we have internally to our minds that is symbolic in some way. So it's not supposed to be like we've got English text typing out in our brain or something, or in our brain mind, which contemporary philosophers, analytic philosophers like to call it. Mentalese is this idea that the way that we think at a deep conceptual level is governed by evolved symbols, and capabilities that give us a kind of capacity exactly that language gives us a problem-solving expression of making propositions and so on and so forth, and allows us to reason in the ways that you've indicated, and allows us to talk about meaning, using linguistic tools. So underneath our natural language, our spoken language, internally is supposed to be this language of mentalese at some level somehow, and there are lots of different arguments about how it works. Very interesting finding recently among philosophers, a lot of work being done by a number of philosophers across different disciplines and philosophers of science, finally decided more or less that they're convinced now that animals have a non-linguistic, what we call second-level conceptual consciousness. Okay, so even though they don't have language, they're now regarded as having consciousness by many philosophers and a number of cognitive scientists and neuroscientists. Now, I don't necessarily find this terribly surprising because, you've ever seen dolphins and chimpanzees and that kind of thing. Well, wahoo. But when you think about what you've just said about the very special role that actual propositional linguistic constructs that we use, that I'm using now and speaking to you, and that you used in asking the question play, then, it's still a very salient question. And the role of philosophers, arguably, at Oxford in the 1950s and 1960s, if you know anything about Wittgenstein and other philosophers that worked in those disciplines, said, look, it's just all about language and language games, and that's the end of the story. You don't ask any more questions if you're a philosopher. That's all there is for you to do. So there are many philosophers that have very well-respected philosophers that agree with you. But somebody like Willard Van Orman Quine, the materialist whose photo came up before, is a materialist philosopher who thinks that, this is a very anachronistic way to put it for him, but he thinks that information occurs and has meaning in a sense the way that Grice does in terms of natural meaning. What it comes down to is that our sensory processing of the information in the distant environment is advanced in a non-linguistic way as well. So I'm not sure whether that makes it easier for us or harder, but that suggests to people like Quine and people like Chalmers and contemporary cognitive scientists like Dennett that philosophers still have something to do, even if some things stop at language. I hope that.
We might just. Paul's got one more question. We might just take one more question after that. Paul.
Just segueing from David's point. Supposing, David's point essentially was we've now got a species has arisen which has got consciousness, which can ask these questions, and it's got language, which recursive language, which you get into. But supposing we had a universe which didn't have somebody developed to the extent of human beings. We still had life forms, and we then asked the question of if there was somebody asked the question, what is the meaning of life? And the life forms there are life forms that don't have sort of self-reflective consciousness. What would your answer be to that, maybe the sort of simpler question, what is the meaning of life in such a universe without self-reflective consciousness life forms asking this question?
Something like, you're talking about pantheism, or am I off track there? Yeah. So, rocks and streams and things have consciousness of a sort, or am I barking up the wrong track?
No, you can abstract a universe with life, plants,
organisms, right,
worms, and so forth and so on, but doesn't have as far as we know, self-reflective consciousness in the way in which we understand it. Then we apply the question, let's say we're a SETI, we're an alien from outer space looking at this world and asking the question, what's the meaning of life in this world? Coming up with a bit of a simplified universe, what would your answer to that question be?
Okay, well, that's a huge question. I mean, there are swamp man arguments and zombie arguments and different things that touch on this in terms of thought experiments. I won't go into them because we've run out of time. It's a fantastic question. I think you can probably... So, what I concluded with was the idea that science is an incredibly fulfilling way, prospectively and arguably, to think about our meaning as subjective individuals, operating in the universe with a consciousness that we certainly appear to have. If you take that away, you've introduced an external observer just to help make sense of the illustration, otherwise it's virtually impossible, I understand that. If you take that away, then arguably, objectively and externally, you can still kind of go in the naturalistic H.P. Rice's first natural meaning, sort of causal indicative sense of meaning. So there's some meaning to be had there, but it's a fairly kind of a thin, not very, what's the right way to express this in more lay terms? I guess sterile is the best word I can come up with. So arguably there's some meaning in a causal chain of reference sense, and there's some meaning in terms of complexity and objectively existing information processing. But in terms of subjective kind of meaning, in terms of qualia and the quality of experience, well, I think it's arguable then that there just isn't any. I think you've deleted it then, that particular side of things. But yeah, so that's interesting. That links up with the religionist habit, if you like, which is quite understandable. So if you look at, we have some theologians with us in the room. Is it perhaps too much of me to ask how the universe comes into existence initially?
Choice.
Choice? Whose choice?
Choices.
Yeah, so, but God's choice?
No.
No, okay, so that's not where I was trying to go, I apologise. That backfired on me. I'll have to get you to explain it to me, Michael. But in the biblical text, God speaks universe into existence. It's linguistic. So it's just interesting that the way that a lot of theistic views and religious views of the universe in existence.
But that's only in linguistic terms.
Okay, I have a challenge here from a theologian. I'm not sure how it works. But excellent question. I feel I haven't answered it, but yeah.
Mine's really quick. So the Dan Dennett, Sam Harris argument. Do you think that's just an argument? Reading both sides, I think it's just an argument maybe of definitions almost.
Yeah, there's certainly an element of that, and that's why instead of approaching the argument they're having correctly, I attacked one of what I think is one of Dennett's premises, and I'm willing to be correct because I may have interpreted it correctly. So Dennett seems to be saying of Harris's argument that Harris says that's not the way that people go about things. We don't think of things like that. We don't really have access to what we don't really have access to what we believe we've got access to in terms of free will. We think we do, that's just not the case. And Dennett wants to undermine, those premises using different arguments. But I'm not sure that I agree with Harris, but not necessarily for Harris's reasons. Yeah. It's an interesting debate.
Yeah.